Greetings to all my viewers. Welcome back to your very own favorite YouTube channel, your one-stop solution for staff exams and military history. In our last episode, Chapter 10 Part 1, we saw how the tragedy of Nam Kachu and the collapse at Tawang forced the Indian army to fall back on Sela. Brigadier Hoshiar Singh inspired his men, declaring it a fortress, and the troops worked day and night to prepare defenses on those icy ridges. But as we discovered, the truth was harsh. Shortages, weak communication, and confused leadership left Sela far more vulnerable than it appeared. Meanwhile, the Chinese kept building roads, massing forces, and preparing for the final assault. And now, friends, moving ahead, let's continue our journey with Chapter 10 Part 2, Fortress Sela. If you're enjoying this journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And for the PDF notes, please feel free to call on the number shown on your screen. Without further delay, let's begin today's story. After the disaster at Nam Kachu, one truth became clear. The Chinese knew far too much. For years, their intelligence web had been active in the frontier. Radio operators intercepted Indian signals with ease, while agents quietly moved through border towns, gathering details. In some cases, the Chinese even slipped bogus messages into Indian army communications, spreading doubt and confusion among already shaken commanders. Every move, every order, every weakness. The Chinese were watching, and they were always one step ahead. Years later, the truth emerged from the pages of Chinese war histories. Yan Xuyuan's True History of the China Border War and the Academy of Military Sciences War of Self-Defensive Counterattack with India revealed just how deeply the PLA understood the battlefield. Their records listed Indian deployments down to platoons and sections, and even carried psychological profiles of Indian commanders. Intelligence Bureau agent Tashi Sonam would later admit with chilling clarity, the Chinese knew everything, sometimes even before the Indians themselves had decided. It was not just a battle of soldiers on the ridges. It was a battle already lost in the shadows. On the Chinese side, the master strategist General Liu Bocheng had drawn up his plan. He knew Sela was a fortress, and a frontal clash would bleed his forces. Instead, he chose a bolder path to outflank Sela, bypass the fortress, and strike directly at Dirang and Bomdila. It was a dangerous gamble. If Sela held firm for even a week, the entire Chinese campaign could unravel. But Liu Bocheng also knew his enemy. The Indian command was rigid, fearful, and divided. And that weakness gave him confidence. The date was set. D-Day, 17 to 18 November 1962. The trap was about to close. By the end of October, Beijing's orders were clear. The Chengdu Military Area Command directed the Tibet military region to prepare for the decisive strike in the eastern Himalayas. The plan was massive in scale. 4 full regiments were tasked with assaulting the fortress of Sela, while additional formations were directed toward Dirang, Dizong and Bomdila. In all, nearly 22,000 soldiers of the PLA began to converge, supported by heavy artillery, mortar batteries, engineers, and transport columns. Alongside them marched the 419th Tibetan Unit and elements of the 55th and 11th Divisions, hardened by years of mountain warfare. Night after night, the valleys echoed with the sounds of construction. Floodlights blazed as bulldozers and labor battalions hacked out new roads from Bomdila to Tawang. Endless columns of soldiers, yaks, and ponies snaked along the ridges, carrying food, ammunition, and even prefabricated bridges. Every hour, their logistical web tightened around Sela. At the final commanders' conference, Marshal Amiliu, appointed overall leader of the campaign, summed up their strategy with chilling precision. The Indians' right is the backbone. The left is the stomach. Strike the stomach, and the body will collapse. The Chinese juggernaut was in motion. The stage was set for the storm that would soon break over Sela. While the Chinese machine prepared with precision, Indian command lived in illusion. At Tejpur headquarters, General B. M. Call and 4 Corps convinced themselves that no major attack would come before the spring of 1963. Their focus shifted instead to Walong, far to the east, while the fortress of Sela was left in dangerous neglect. By 11th November, Chinese infiltration columns were already moving, hauling mortars, Garhwal rifles, and supplies across snow-bound passes. Indian patrols reported road building, mule trains, even convoys under floodlights. Yet at headquarters, these warnings were brushed aside as exaggerations. Inside warm bunkers, senior officers reassured one another that nothing would happen until next year. But outside, on those frozen ridges, the Jawans stood watch in blizzards, knowing in their bones that the storm was coming. To guard the approaches around Sela, 4 Rajput under Lieutenant Colonel Avasthi was pushed out to cover the flanks and secure Bridge 1. Companies were scattered thin, one at Dirang, another at Sapper Camp, others stretched toward the Bhutan border passes. Their task was impossible for the numbers they had. The Rajput faced the mountains with little more than Angola shirts and thin blankets as icy winds cut through the valleys. At point 3446, men dug bunkers into frozen rock, knowing they could not be relieved if attacked. Worse still, the Chinese were already ahead of them. Infiltrators disguised as Monpa villagers slipped through Indian lines, carrying hidden weapons and feeding intelligence back to their commanders. And yet, Indian higher command clung to a dangerous assumption that no more than a single company of Chinese could ever cross Poshing-La. The Rajput, under-equipped and underinformed, were left to hold a crumbling flank against an enemy that was already inside the gates. On 15th November, a patrol of 5 guards under Captain Amarjit Sinha moved cautiously near Tasila. Out of the mist came sudden fire. The patrol was ambushed, cut apart on the mountain slopes. The survivors staggered back to Poshing-La, only to be hit again. Mortar shells rained down, forcing them to fall back toward Tungri, where they joined elements of the Assam Rifles in a desperate night defense. But it was hopeless. Under pounding fire, the Guards and Assam Rifles withdrew once more, this time to Tembang. The disaster was complete. Chinese infiltrators had broken through. The flank had collapsed. And now, the road to Dirang lay wide open. While the flanks collapsed, at Dirang Dzong headquarters, there were still no defenses prepared. No bunkers. No minefields. Nothing. Major General Pathania was gripped by panic. Instead of a clear plan, he ordered piecemeal deployments, Rajput patrols here, Marathas and guards scattered there, each one stumbling into firefights without support. Worse still, the Chinese intelligence web struck again. Over the radios, false Hindi messages crackled through, "Stop firing." Confused operators obeyed, breaking contact at the worst possible moments. By 16th November, Pathania was already whispering to his staff, preparing to abandon Dirang HQ and flee south. The fortress line was crumbling, not by Chinese firepower alone, but by Indian paralysis at the top. On 16th November, the men of 4 Garhwal Rifles stood firm at Nuranang, their defense strengthened by the guns of 2 Derjat mountain battery. Disguised in Monpa robes, Chinese infiltrators crept close in the dark. But Subedar Uday Singh spotted the deception and struck first. At dawn, the real storm began. Wave after wave of Chinese troops surged at the Galwalis. Alpha Company faced 5 full assaults, rifles blazing, grenades flying, the men refusing to give an inch. When ammunition began to run low, 2nd Lieutenant Vinod Goswami and Quartermaster Bands carried supplies themselves, sprinting through shell fire to the trenches. Wounded and bleeding, Lance Naik Ranjit Singh kept hurling grenades until his last breath. And in one of the most iconic moments of the war, Rifleman Jaswant Singh Rawat charged forward, seized an enemy machine gun, and turned it on the attackers before being shot down. By evening, the battlefield lay littered with Chinese bodies. More than 300 enemy soldiers lay dead. The Garhwalis had lost only 2 men, Against impossible odds, Nuranang had become a symbol of raw courage, a moment when Indian soldiers proved they could turn the tide. But even as the Garhwalis stood proud at Nuranang, news came that stunned every soldier. From division headquarters crackled the order, withdraw immediately. An impregnable position, defended with blood and bravery, was to be abandoned in the dead of night. Like Bomdila before it, a hard-won victory was thrown away, not by the enemy, but by India's own higher command. The men left their bunkers reluctantly, glancing back at the ground they had held with such courage. Chinese bodies lay scattered across no man's land, proof of what Indian grit could achieve. Yet the decision was final. By abandoning Nuranang, the fate of Sela Brigade was sealed. By the night of 17th November, the news had tightened. Chinese infiltrations had already severed supply lines. The flanks lay broken, and despite their victory, Nuranang had been abandoned. Now, the Sela Brigade stood alone, cut off, cold, and surrounded. Inside the fortress, fear gnawed at the men. Orders were confused, leadership divided. While Jawans shivered in snow-filled bunkers, headquarters still debated over maps, sipping tea, blind to the storm closing in. Across the valleys, Chinese columns advanced silently, their red arrows already carving into Indian lines. The once proud fortress of Sela was no longer a shield. It was a trap, waiting for the blow that would shatter it forever. By this, we come to the end of Chapter 10. In this part, we witnessed how the Chinese closed their grip, infiltrating, cutting supply lines, and breaking the flanks. At Nuranang, the Garhwalis proved Indian courage could defy impossible odds. But their victory was thrown away by a shocking withdrawal order. By the night of 17th November, Sela was no longer a fortress. It was a trap. Surrounded, cut off, and betrayed by failed leadership, thousands of brave Jawans now waited for the storm that was about to fall upon them. So here we come to the end of this chapter. Friends, if you're finding this journey meaningful and informative, do show your support. Please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. And for those who want the PDF notes, feel free to call on the number shown on your screen. Stay tuned, because the story of 1962 is far from over. Until next time, Jai Hind.